A new series of explosions in Crimea. God, SBU, don't stop. Starkankut, Donoslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol, explosions. Panic has started in Crimea. There is an evacuation in Crimea. The SBU has begun the second phase of the special operation, the Kerch Bridge and Russia's nuclear triad. Ukraine is attacking two parts of Russia's nuclear triad, the Northern Fleet headquarters, Severomorsk nuclear submarines, strategic nuclear bombers, and the Kerch Bridge.
The bridge is damaged. That is, at least one of the bridge's supports is damaged. If we look at the overall attack on Russian strategic targets, specifically strategic ones, for example, strikes on Russian strategic aviation aircraft, these are strategic targets, especially when there are 5 of them. As it turned out, there are 5, just as we said. The thing is, they didn't count the one at Ukrainka. At least one Tu-95 at Ukrainka has already been confirmed hit. So strategic aviation, and after that, the strategic bridge. The bridge is real. It has strategic significance because it connects Russian Taman with our peninsula Crimea. And if it is put out of commission, destroyed completely, in principle, until we liberate Crimea, or let's say until it's possible to approach with bombers and simply drop hundreds of aerial bombs on this bridge, it can't be destroyed. There are certain factors that make it impossible to do this. Only engineering methods can be used to destroy it. That means blowing up all the columns. There will be a lot of problems with its deactivation from its active state. But simply damaging it at this point, as it was damaged at one time by the security services, both in 2022 and in 2023, putting it out of commission for a certain period, at least for half a year, for the duration, for example, of a summer campaign. That would really be a breakthrough. Moreover, a significant and deliberate strike specifically on the Kerch Bridge is closely tied to the official start of our liberation campaign to deoccupy the Crimean Peninsula. Why? Because without question, the bridge must first be destroyed or damaged or put out of commission. There are different ways to do this, to put it out of commission so that the Russians can't transfer enough troops to Crimea. After that, with long-range strike capabilities using the same drones and missiles to Crimea, which is 200 to 300 kilometers away, we have the ability, since almost all our equipment can reach that distance. So this is the main range for our strike systems, long-range operational level systems, which are also handled by the security service. That's why I think the next wave will be strikes specifically on military targets in Crimea, of which there are at least 100 stationary ones currently operating and about 100 mobile ones as well. The work of the special services, there is still a vast amount of so-called work ahead, but you could already say that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the beginning of this liberation campaign in Crimea.
Roman Igorovich, regarding the nuclear triad, I heard a comment from Keith Kellogg. He is simply stunned. He believes this is a huge, colossal problem for Russia. He calls it escalation, that Ukraine struck at 2 components of the Russian Federation's nuclear triad. This is the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation, where the nuclear submarines are located. And of course, the strategic nuclear aviation. How much of a breakthrough is this? And do you feel that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the second phase of the SBU special operation?
Well, that means there will be a third one. If, for example, they hit a Russian submarine, I wouldn't be surprised. On the same Northern Fleet, on the same Pacific Fleet, because they feel too comfortable in the seas. We have already struck both Russian ground positions and Russian strategic positions. Only the so-called naval component remains. Therefore, in the near future, most likely, if you remember, or rather, if you haven't noticed, the main intelligence directorate has gone quiet somewhere. They carried out operations in Vladivostok against the Russian Pacific Fleet and then went silent somewhere, not ruling out the possibility that another Russian submarine might be next. Putin, as always, will say, what happened to the Kursk, to the submarine? It sank. What happened to the strategic aviation? It burned down. What happened to the Pacific Fleet? It broke up at Kavark. So this could also be something we just have to wait for. There is probably still a third serious blow ahead. Then this is the first one you correctly pointed out regarding the triad. Emphasize this point properly. Why? Because the air component is one of the main components and it was the first to be put into service. It is precisely the strategic bombers that are Russia's strategic nuclear weapons. Malyuk's strike showed that this component no longer dominates the world. Definitely. Why? Because a $500 drone or a sufficient number of drones that could destroy almost all Russian strategic aviation, This is possible. Everyone understands perfectly well that the era of drones has already begun. The era of drones seems to be such that in the near future, planet Earth will turn into this. Planet Shelizyak. There is no water, no vegetation, no minerals, and it is inhabited by robots. That is, it is populated by such drones, and in the end, this apocalypse can, of course, come true, which was once shown in Hollywood films. That is to say, this problem really exists in all countries of the world that have invested in strategic security mechanisms. Well, what was the point of investing tens of trillions of dollars over the past 100 years if in the end a $500 drone can just take everything out in 1, 2, 3, as Malyuk demonstrated? That's why I would say that Malyuk and the security service of Ukraine have become the cornerstone at the beginning of a new era of security. Other mechanisms, the real investment should be in robots. By robots, I mean, of course, drones. Drones that can perform major tasks with minimal funding. Basically, all these strategies will eventually be destroyed. At one time, if anyone remembers, Reagan, I think, may he rest in peace, once said he had a great monologue where he asked, where are those 6-story fools, the dinosaurs, where are they? Extinct. But the little bug, it's been living and thriving for 30 billion years. Roughly speaking, that's what the next era will be like, something along those lines. So the little bugs we're talking about now, that is the small drones, they will get smaller, but they won't lose their combat effectiveness. And eventually, what will it come to? What Putin once recently anticipated together with Skabiva and all that Russian media riffraff, Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. You were just laughing about the combat mosquitoes. Believe me, when billions of Ukrainian combat mosquitoes enter Russian Siberia or beyond the Urals, I'm not even talking about up to the Urals, there won't be a single Russian left there. They'll be drawn by the scent, and the Russian spirit smells so strong, oh boy, no filter can help with that. You have to put on a gas mask if there's a Russian Federation guy standing nearby. So naturally, following the scent, these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes will wipe out the entire Russian herd, all this Russian Federation herd that attacked Ukraine.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet of Russia, how feasible is it to conduct a special operation there at all?
Well, it's definitely possible. As for the Northern Fleet, on the one hand, it's simply closer because it's just over 1,000 kilometers away, and we've already carried out missions there before. Olenia is not far from the base, right? So in principle, this direction is possible even with long-range strike systems launched from our territory. But as for Vladivostok, in some ways, it's even easier. We've discussed this before. What is Vladivostok? Well, that's the Green Wedge. That's the far eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, which is populated not by robots, but by Ukrainians. Well, Ukrainians, genetically for over 100 years, tens of thousands of Ukrainians were brought there under certain programs, mostly from Poltava and Chernihiv regions. Why is there an airfield called Chernihivka there? Well, that's just what I know about the airfields, for example. Chernihivka and also Ukrainka, well, those are our people from Poltava and residents of the Chernihiv region back in the day. Naturally, genetic roots become apparent and noticeable. And Vladivostok is actually one of the main jewels of our Ukrainian Green Wedge. Yes, Vladivostok, of course, getting there is a bit of a challenge, all the more so if in the end we recognize the government in exile of the far eastern Ukrainian People's Republic. Then it could, for example, sign agreements with, say, Japan about the return of those same disputed islands, well, so-called disputed, but they're actually Japanese islands. And Sakhalin is a Japanese island too. So this issue really needs to be addressed there. And at the same time, of course, we should put pressure on the Pacific Fleet because there are Ukrainians in the fleet as well. Do you really think there aren't any of our midshipmen there? There practically every other person has Ukrainian, well, that kind of deep-rooted genetic tree among the midshipmen, because back in the day, in the Soviet army, all the warrant officers were Ukrainians. And all the midshipmen in the fleet were Ukrainians too. So believe me, if the survival of our nation is at stake, this so-called ancestral call will make it possible to sink practically the entire Pacific Fleet. And if we approach relations with the Japanese and South Koreans correctly, they'll even help us because it's in their interest too.
Roman Grigorievich, when I spoke with military analysts, they said that the Topol and Yars are part of the powerful nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. How important are these assets? And for example, is destroying a Topol or Yars also a realistic goal for the special services, Ukrainian ones, of course?
Well, that's rather complicated, of course. The thing is, these are, after all, troops, strategic troops, missile forces. That is, there is a certain selection process for service there. There are some aspects related to polygraph testing, so there is a very strict control over this component, and it would be very difficult, for example, to get close enough to destroy these missiles. The Russians will ruin them themselves. Well, knowing that they're all butterfingered, they'll ruin them themselves. The Topol is an excellent, excellent missile. It was first launched, I think, back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. And then the Russians later refined it to a more or less acceptable state. But the main basic, so to speak, fundamental starting conditions, of course, were still set in the Soviet Union. They had a good school there, a rocket school, especially after our Ukrainian basically put everything into the rocket program, if you remember. That is, while serving as General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Khrushchev accomplished this task and Brezhnev refined it further. Again, both were Ukrainians, both of them. That's why the rocket industry, of course, was very well developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians picked up certain aspects, but because the Soviet Union collapsed and the components of the overall production cycle ended up split among different republics, most of them, by the way, were here, specifically in Ukraine, because we built the SS-18, the Satan missile at Yuzhmash. That was us. Naturally, the Topol is a successor of this kind of missile program. The Topol-M in particular is a pretty good missile. The second one after it is also, well, not exactly a clone, but roughly the same kind of missile, just with a different warhead, one with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. That's the Yars. So after the Topol, then the Yars, the RS-24, then the RS-26, they built or tried to build the Oreshnik, also known as the Rubezh. That's the Rubezh, which Putin called Oreshnik. And the next line, the fourth missile, is the RS-28, which is the Sarmat. But the Sarmat can't even get off the launch pad. Out of 7 launches, there have been 6 explosions and several silos were completely destroyed. Most likely, this whole series of missiles is finished. So they won't really have the Sarmat, and they'll keep fussing over the Oreshnik like a fool with a rattle. But once its media hype dies down, at least the possible pressure from it, they'll forget about it too. But there are 2 missiles that are serious and problematic for us, and for the whole world for that matter, the Topol and the Yars. They can travel more than 10,000 kilometers. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both the Topol and the Yars have nuclear warheads, and the Yars has multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, about 6 warheads, each with its own guidance system that are deployed. So this really is a serious problem, but it's probably not that much of a problem for us because, well, these are nuclear weapons and the Russians aren't going to use nukes against us. And as for launching conventional intercontinental ballistic missiles at us, well, that's like using a microscope to hammer in nails. So it's not a problem for us. It's a problem for NATO generals and for the Chinese as well. In other words, these are long-range destruction mechanisms. For us, the main problem is the Iskanders. The Iskanders, KN-23s, and also Kinzhal missiles. That is ballistic and aeroballistic missiles that need to be neutralized. The optimal way to neutralize the use of these missiles is, of course, to destroy the Russian hydrocarbon industry, because everything runs on something, on diesel, on gasoline, on aviation kerosene. The hydrocarbon sector needs to be destroyed. Bankova has ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon sector. That's why this problem exists, because it's very difficult to defend against a ballistic missile. We should have had our own a long time ago. It's already the 7th year. We probably could have already set up serious production of these missiles, but so far they're still nowhere to be seen. Well, we hope that eventually we'll get them, our own ballistic missiles. But the real problem for us, of course, is the Russian Iskanders, because first we need to destroy all Russian oil refineries, everything related to fuel production. And second, of course, is air defense, meaning we need to increase the number of anti-ballistic systems like Patriot, SAMP-T. There's no third option.
Roman Grigorievich, you have always said that we need to turn our attention to occupied Crimea. And now the SBU has carried out a successful special operation. Then bridges near Melitopol were blown up. Yes, these are very important logistical hubs that connect the occupied peninsula with the occupied south of Ukraine, and essentially they supply the enemy's grouping. How do you assess the situation? Last night there were explosions, and during the day the explosions in Crimea continue. We are attacking military targets. Please, the floor is yours.
In Crimea, they packed in, like sardines in a can, several million Russians from beyond the Urals who were promised something grand. Basically, they've increased the number of Russian cattle in Crimea. Naturally, they've also packed in military facilities there for almost 11, well, it's the 12th year now, practically. Before that, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was based there. We allowed them to do this. Well, mostly our so-called great leaders who looked so far ahead that in the end they lost Crimea. From the very beginning, back in 2014, they allowed the loss of Crimea. So a large number of Russian civilian invaders, and to be clear, they are indeed civilian invaders, not military personnel, and none of the usual legal protections apply to them under international law. They just don't know it, or perhaps they are simply unaware of this important fact. Any Russian who is on the occupied territory of Ukraine is considered an invader, and none of the conventions that apply to civilians apply to them. That is naturally, for us, they are the same kind of invaders as all the other so-called Russian military combatants who are in Crimea and are subject to elimination. Eliminating them in principle is not that difficult, specifically in Crimea. Why? Because Crimea itself is an enclosed area squeezed between the two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. In other words, it is practically a ready-made geographic operational cauldron with only two entry and exit points, from Taman via the Kerch Bridge and through the land corridors connecting it to mainland Ukraine. Mainly, if you look at the railway, it's towards Melitopol, you're right, through those branches go there. That's why, for us, when it comes to liberating Ukraine, it's important to start liberating everything from Crimea, because it's much easier to free Ukrainian territory if we liberate Crimea first. Moreover, it's even easier to liberate Crimea itself. If you compare, for example, the ratio of forces and resources needed to liberate Donbass, you need an order of magnitude fewer forces and resources to liberate Crimea than to liberate Donbass. That's why, without a doubt, Crimea is simply asking to be the first, the very first, to break free from Russian captivity. There are a lot of mechanisms. How can this be done? Well, first of all, of course, we need to cut off all the bridges that connect Crimea to the Russians. There are several of these bridges. Well, the first bridge is the Kerch Bridge. Moreover, there are several there. A railway bridge, a road bridge, an energy bridge, a fuel bridge, and a water bridge. All of these are part of the Kerch system, the entire Kerch Bridge system. And without a doubt, all of them, all 5 of these bridges need to be destroyed in this regard. The second bridge, the one next to the Kerch Bridge, is the ferry crossing. The floating docks need to be destroyed. The floating docks, and of course, especially the railway ferries. The third bridge of this kind is the so-called sea bridge. That is to say, these are in fact the very same BDKs, which are also known as large landing ships, and they can be used as ferries for transporting vehicles, equipment, and personnel between different ports. For example, they can operate from the Russian Black Sea coast to our Crimea, serving as a vital connection. There are still several large landing ships left. The Russians can use them to transport a fairly large amount of weaponry with significant tonnage. Then there's the air bridge. Well, the air bridge is a bit simpler. That is, these are planes, these are airfields that can be targeted, and in principle, the air bridge can be cut off. And the main thing, of course, is the so-called land bridge, the land corridor, which the Russians are now trying to hold at a depth of 80 kilometers. By the way, it's very difficult to do this since it's pressed up against the Azov coast. And there are several branches of both highways and railways running through there. So, of course, you can target them, starting from Rostov, Taganrog, then through Mius, and then through Kalmius. And the bridges, but in reality, of course, it's very close for us. It's only 80 to 100 kilometers to Melitopol and to the crossings, both types, meaning the northern crossings. And basically, that's probably what we'll do. That's why these strikes, which happen simultaneously on both the Kerch Bridge and the bridge near Melitopol, specifically targeted the railway junctions. This is exactly that kind of operation. First, cut off the supply systems and then hit them with long-range strike assets. Everyone understands perfectly well that if we manage to gather nearly 1,000 drones for Moscow, then we can definitely find 500 drones once a week for Crimea. The main thing now is to retarget specifically to this component. Then the milestone regarding the liberation of Crimea is the third strike on the Kerch Bridge. You could say that the liberation of Crimea will begin with this strike. First, with long-range strike assets, they will dismantle Crimea molecule by molecule over the course of, well, half a year or even a year. Realistically, if you break it down by actions, first, for several months up to a year, we need to use drones and missiles to strike military targets in Crimea. And only then, starting next spring or maybe during the summer campaign of 2026, will our troops actually move into Crimea by land. But that's the optimal scenario. Of course, without air support, it's impossible to advance there. That's why I think that by next spring, we'll already have a sufficient number of Air Force units to provide support for a ground operation. And for a year, of course, we'll be relentlessly striking Crimea from all sides.
All in all, the summer of 2025 in Crimea promises to be a hot one.
Absolutely. And the Russians really need to start remembering. As we discussed with you back in 2023, they need to learn how to swim because the Kerch Bridge won't be there. The exits from Crimea will definitely be under control, so the Russians will have to swim freestyle, breaststroke, or dog paddle their way out of Crimea if they don't leave now by car or train, because those routes simply won't exist.
Run, run, Russians, get out of Crimea. Friends, please like this video. Write in the comments what you think about our special operations, about the second and third phases of the SBU special operation. And Roman Grigorievich and I continue discussing the SBU operation Web. It can be put on par with the elimination of Osama bin Laden, according to US Senator Richard Blumenthal. He called the operation itself proof of Ukraine's agility and determination. He said that these strikes disprove the false narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and could shift momentum in Washington toward increasing aid to Ukraine. They can strike air bases 4,000 miles from Ukraine. They can hit anywhere. In terms of sheer skill and audacity, these attacks can be ranked alongside the US raid on Osama bin Laden and the Israeli operation with the Entebbe raid as some of the greatest military achievements of recent years. Roman Grigorievich, please comment.
The Americans weren't shocked because we struck the Russians. The Americans imagined themselves in that situation, and now they're shocked to realize that their air bases are just as exposed as the Russian ones. They were protected from each other by treaties. That is, there were certain, if I'm not mistaken, there was specific protection for strategic strike assets under these treaties. Moreover, one of the primary conditions was that these planes specifically had to be accessible for monitoring by external surveillance systems like satellites. So, as a direct result, both the Russians and the Americans are required to park their respective aircraft in areas that are clearly visible to the opposing side. But we're not adversaries. No one told Malyuk that. He hasn't even read New Start. Naturally, he went ahead and struck the Russian strategic forces, taking one issue off the table. And now the Americans are thinking, wait a minute, the same thing could happen at their own bases. And their bases are wide open. Nobody's even bothered to secure them. If the Chinese or the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians set out to take out the Russian strategic forces, the American strategic forces, there aren't any like that either. And if they get serious about it, especially the Chinese, we can see how the Chinese have really pulled ahead of everyone else in this regard. So that's their problem now. They weren't shocked by our so-called audacity. They were shocked by their own vulnerability to these kinds of strike weapons like drones, even a simple cheap drone.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich, today I read a brilliant analysis by a woman on Facebook, a Ukrainian, a patriot. She wrote that the whole world, which is afraid of escalation, of nuclear escalation, which didn't give us long-range missiles, which didn't give us Taurus and other missiles that could have destroyed this entire nuclear triad, they're simply shocked and frightened that Ukraine managed to do all this without their help. Isn't that right, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, that's exactly right. Kudos to the person who saw it that way. All these military, someone who is closely involved with military matters. That's exactly how it is. What was important in the last century is now absolutely irrelevant, just as what was important in the century before last was irrelevant for the last century, right? No one nowadays remembers the sling or the boomerang. Of course, I don't mean the missile. No one remembers bows, arrows, or spears anymore. Now, I mean in the last century, when rockets appeared, when airplanes appeared, and now we're already at the next stage. In other words, what was needed in the last century is simply unnecessary now. Strategic bombers are no longer needed, nor, for example, is that same fleet that used to consume trillions of dollars. Just think how much had to be invested, trillions of dollars. And now it turns out, well, Malyuk, the decision to destroy Russia's strategic aviation has basically crossed out this almost century-long saga of, to put it bluntly, looting the world's largest military budgets. Trillions of dollars were invested in this, and now they're simply unnecessary. One of Ukraine's security services just gave them a big fat raspberry. All of this entire strategic triad, no matter what form it takes, even the nuclear component of this strategic triad for us, it's not frightening for one simple reason. We have means of nuclear strike that are much more powerful, stronger, and more problematic for the enemy than theirs. A nuclear warhead that explodes, sometimes it's not even clear whether it was a nuclear explosion or just a serious conventional missile. You can only tell with a radiometer. The glow from radionuclides that accompanies a nuclear explosion, if it is a nuclear explosion, fades quickly. And believe me, if you dump spent nuclear fuel rods on Moscow, we've talked about this so many times, Lenin would come back to life. Yes, he'd be more alive than anyone from the radiation that would fall, say, on Red Square. If the Russians use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, they understand this perfectly well. Why have they gone quiet on the nuclear topic now? Because they realized that it wasn't for nothing that they poked a hole in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And who knows what might fall out onto Grandpa Lenin. Maybe a third head will grow and start running around saying that you're on the right path, comrades. Well, more or less wherever it's pointed to go. Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, let me just ask you the following question. First of all, after the SBU attacks on strategic nuclear aviation, Z channels reported the following information: that in Moscow, Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash, the commander of the Russian Air Force, accidentally fell out of a window. And now everyone is starting to count how many strategic bombers we've destroyed or eliminated. That is, 41 have been damaged or destroyed. How significant are these losses? Please comment on this as a conclusion. Well, if this isn't an information operation, it could be a Russian information operation. They sometimes inject this kind of event into the information flow through certain dubious channels. Then if the opposing side picks it up, for example, they present it as something negative. Then they show this Kobylash, yes, and will say that we are not quite the right kind of people in how we handle this. So for now, at this moment, since there is no confirmation and there really isn't any, we treat it accordingly. Although, strictly speaking, in terms of responsibility, well, Kobylash should have been made to fly. As for who will, so to speak, make him fly, or has made him, or will make him, that will depend on the Russian special services. Because if we're talking about real responsibility, it was specifically Kobylyash's responsibility to ensure the security of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. So, well, if not now, then later he'll have to fly. How else could it be?
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss the most pressing military topics and to celebrate the successes of our Ukrainian special services and the armed forces of Ukraine. We thank them. Our deepest respect. The well-known analyst Roman Tsvetan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much. As always, see you again soon this week.
Goodbye.